Grigori Yefimovich, better known as Rasputin, was born around the year 1869 in a small village known as Pokrovske in Siberia to a family of peasants. In spite of receiving a basic education, it's probable that he never learned to read or write. Accounts from some people from his Siberian village claim that he possessed supernatural powers, while others give reference to acts of extreme inhumanity and cruelty. His name Rasputin is said to derive from his known degenerate behavior. It was said that Rasputin simply meant debauched one in Russian. However, historians now believe it meant where two rivers met, in reference to where he was born in Siberia, because Pokrovske lies on the Tura River that comes in from the east, from the Ural Mountains, and eventually meets the Tobol River. In 1892, at the age of 18, he underwent a conversion and wound up at a monastery in Verkhoturye, where he came across a religious sect known as a Klisti. This underground sect, derived from the Russian Orthodox Church, existed from the mid-17th century up until the late 20th century. The central belief that drove this sect was the practice of asceticism, meaning they had to avoid indulgence and be severely disciplined. Yet, they also believed that in order to gain God's divine grace and mercy, they must first submit themselves to sin. This thought was reflected in ecstatic rituals that would become sexual orgies. Rasputin fit right in. Rasputin is often characterized by his sexual appetite, which he justified by twisting the doctrines of the Klisti sect. Known by many as a sexual deviant, it is believed that his sexual lifestyle was, although mostly true, exaggerated by his enemies as social propaganda in order to get the Russian people to hate him. Although he entered the monastery and remained there for some years, Rasputin eventually left and actually never took any religious vows. He then married and fathered 4 children. However, marriage did not suit him. He eventually left Siberia and began wandering the Russian Empire, supposedly as a spiritual pilgrimage. He lived off the charity that he would collect as a self-proclaimed holy man, claiming to have healing powers and to be able to foretell the future. In 1903, he found his way to Petrograd, now known as St. Petersburg, where his fame as a mystic and healer followed him. He was received by the bishop, Hermogen, and he quickly inserted himself into high society, being at the center of some of the most prominent families at the time. This was in large part down to Russian nobles being intrigued by all things relating to mysticism. 2 years later, in 1905, he was introduced to the imperial family, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. The Tsar wrote to one of his ministers, speaking of Rasputin, "A few days ago, I received a peasant, Grigori Rasputin, who brought me an icon of Saint Simon Verkhoturye. He made a remarkably strong impression both on Her Majesty and on myself, so that instead of 5 minutes, our conversation went on for more than an hour." However, what led to become the Empress's closest and most trusted advisor was due to the secret being kept by the imperial family, which just so happened to be their biggest vulnerability. Once Rasputin learnt of this secret, he took full advantage of it. The secret, only known by the immediate family, was that Tsar Nicholas's only son, Alexei, and thus his successor, was a hemophiliac. This disease added a sense of desperation to the entire family, as the entire future of the Romanov dynasty relied on a sickly young boy, and because his blood couldn't clot properly, even the slightest cut could cost him his life and end the dynasty that had ruled over Russia for over 300 years. This sense of desperation that surrounded the imperial family was the perfect circumstance for Rasputin to sweep in with his so-called healing powers and present himself as the only salvation for the young prince. In 1908, he was summoned to the palace to attend to the young prince as he suffered from a bleeding episode that grew worse and more life-threatening by the hour. Rasputin succeeded in calming the child and subsequently stopped the bleeding, only feeding the belief surrounding his alleged healing powers. It is often brought into question if he in fact possessed any healing powers at all. Some say he managed it through hypnosis, while other historians speculate that the bleeding stopped because Rasputin would insist on removing the administration of aspirin. It was unknown to medics at the time, but aspirin is a blood thinning agent that only worsened the young prince's conditions. Other sources claim that Rasputin was able to calm Alexandra, who would in turn transmit this calmness to her son. Apparently, this mindset would relieve Alexei's discomfort and stop his bleeding. After Rasputin managed to stop this bleeding episode, Alexandra was utterly convinced of his abilities and immediately became solely dependent on the monk, establishing him as her sole advisor. Rasputin in turn warned the Tsar and Tsarina that he alone was the only person capable of curing their sickly son, and therefore he was the only hope for the entire dynasty. This assured Rasputin a place within the royal entourage. In the presence of the imperial family, Rasputin presented himself as a devout, moral, and mystic monk, but when he left the palace and the presence of the Tsarina, he was a rampant sexual deviant, frequenting local brothels and seducing noble women. He preached any sexual contact with him had a healing and purifying effect, for if you touched him, you would touch God's own grace flowing through him. Eventually, the stories of this sexually crazed monk reached the ears of the Tsar. Nicholas II refused to believe that they were speaking of the holy man who was so close to the family and his wife's most trusted advisor. Rasputin's accusers would in turn find themselves exiled from court, and some were even removed from the positions of power that they held. However, by 1911, Rasputin's decadent lifestyle became a national scandal. Various journalists and politicians used Rasputin's close relationship to the Tsars as a way to undermine their rule and push for political reform within Russia. They would publish stories speaking of the mad sexually crazed monk that had the ear of the Tsarina. Some even claimed he influenced the Tsar himself and counseled him on political matters. Yet, in reality, Rasputin's influence was limited only to the young Prince Alexei's health. Nevertheless, politicians were convinced that every poor decision taken by the Tsar was because he was being poisoned by this monk who was undermining the imperial family from the inside. The Prime Minister himself, Pyotr Stolypin, approached Tsar Nicholas on the matter and came forth with a series of accounts confirming his immoral behavior. Consequently, Nicholas II exiled Rasputin from his court and sent him away from Petrograd. Only a few months later, however, Tsarina Alexandra brought him back to the palace, and Nicholas, not wanting to displease his wife, who at the time was beginning to suffer from anxiety and nervous episodes, chose to ignore the opinions of his ministers, the public, as well as a scandal surrounding Rasputin. After 7 years of being in the trusted circle of the imperial family, as the primary caretaker of the prince and closest advisor to the queen, in 1915, Rasputin reached the peak of his influence within the imperial family and Russian politics. World War I had broken out, and Russia had just begun to mobilize its forces. In September of the same year, under the advice of his wife and Rasputin, Tsar Nicholas left St. Petersburg and headed to the battlefield in order to take command of his own forces. With the Tsar away fighting on the Eastern Front, he left the Tsarina as his appointed regent to rule on his behalf and take charge of all internal affairs. Yet, the German-born princess couldn't fill the power vacuum left by her husband. So, she turned to her most trusted advisor, Rasputin. In essence, he was ruling Russia through her. Alexandra dismissed any ministers who spoke against her beloved advisor, and Rasputin used his influence to appoint church officials and cabinet ministers. Russian ministers tried to warn the queen of Rasputin's negative influence and how it was affecting the empire, but she continued to defend him, oblivious to the repercussions it had and what it would cost her. On the front lines, soldiers would hear of the mad monk and the German Tsarina ruling Russia in the Tsar's absence. Soldiers would speak of the rumours regarding an intimate relationship between the monk and their queen, as well as how Rasputin had seduced her and was now virtually ruling the country while the Tsar was fighting the Germans at the Eastern Front. They would also hear and spread outlandish stories that Rasputin was in league with the Germans and how he apparently was a sole conspirator of a cholera epidemic that spread through St. Petersburg. While this was all far from true, these stories angered the Russian people and convinced them that Rasputin must be removed from power by whatever means possible. As the situation grew worse within Russia, as well as in the war, a sentiment of revolution grew stronger by the day. The resentment of the people toward Rasputin also grew continuously. They were convinced that the mad monk was manipulating the Tsars, and he was the cause of the misfortune that befell the whole country. In these years, several attempts were made on Rasputin's life, all to no avail. In 1916, a group of extreme conservatives, led by a member of the royal family, Prince Felix Yusupov, husband to the Tsar's niece, conspired to take the monk's life and save the monarchy. Just past midnight, on December the 30th, they invited Rasputin to dinner at the prince's estate, where they had prepared Russian pastries and wine laced with cyanide poison. However, the poison seemed to take no effect, so a panicked Yusupov took a gun and shot Rasputin. Fatally wounded, he managed to run into the courtyard where the conspirators found him and then shot him again, this time supposedly in the head. They then bound him and threw him into the freezing cold Neva River, where, if he wasn't yet dead by the poisoning or the 2 gunshot wounds, he died by drowning. While the elites saw this as a victory and rejoiced, the peasantry mourned. He was one of their own, killed by their oppressors because he had made it to a position of influence. After the death of Rasputin, what most came to realize was that his influence wasn't the sole cause of the Tsar's incompetence to rule. The tragic events that followed only sealed the fate of the imperial family, set in motion by this mad monk. Strangely enough, Rasputin had predicted prior to his death that if he be killed by government officials, the Russian family would be murdered by the people of Russia. Although it was just a letter sent to Tsar Nicholas in order to stop him from doing Rasputin any harm, 15 months later, what he said came to pass. During the Russian Revolution, almost all of the royal family were assassinated. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Rasputin. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave me a like and a comment down below. If you're new, why not subscribe? My mother actually recommended I do this story, even though it's quite of more of the well-known ones I've done. I thought I'd do it for her. If anyone else has any more suggestions, please leave it in the comments or in my email found in the description. That will be all from me, and I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks!